Every parent knows the heartbreak of watching their child lose something precious. Every child remembers the moment they realized the adults they trusted weren't telling them everything. In 1965, 8-year-old Emily Chen thought she had lost her beloved terrier Max forever when he vanished on a cold winter day. For 3 days, she searched and called his name until her voice was hoarse. Then, one evening, she opened the front door and found him shivering on the porch. Emily wrapped Max in her coat and brought him inside, tears of joy streaming down her face. But that night, she heard her parents whispering in the kitchen about Max's disappearance. They used strange words she didn't understand. Words about teaching lessons and making points. As days passed, Emily began to piece together fragments of a truth that would shake her faith in the people she loved most. Max hadn't simply wandered off and gotten lost. Someone had taken him on purpose. What had really happened to Max during those 3 cold days? And why would her own family keep such a painful secret from her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1965 settled over Maplewood Heights like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the comfortable rhythms of suburban life that Emily Chen had known all her 8 years. Snow dusted the carefully manicured lawns of Elm Street, where identical ranch houses stood in neat rows, each with its own small front porch and carefully tended gardens sleeping beneath the frost. The neighborhood hummed with the quiet prosperity of the post-war boom fathers who commuted to downtown offices, mothers who kept immaculate homes, and children who played safely in tree-lined streets until the streetlights flickered on. Emily's world revolved around the warm certainty of routine. Each morning, she would wake to the smell of her mother's coffee brewing and the gentle murmur of her parents' voices drifting up from the kitchen below. Her father, Dr. James Chen, was already dressed in his crisp white shirt and narrow tie, his medical bag positioned by the front door like a faithful companion. He was a pediatrician at Mercy General Hospital, a man whose gentle hands could calm the most frightened child and whose patient voice could ease any worried parent's concerns. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had worked hard to earn his place in this comfortable neighborhood. His thick-rimmed glasses and carefully combed black hair giving him an air of scholarly authority. Margaret Chen moved through their home like a graceful dancer, her movements economical and purposeful. At 32, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that came not from expensive clothes, but from an innate sense of how to make any space feel welcoming. Her dark hair was always perfectly styled in the fashionable bouffant of the era, and her dresses were pressed to crisp perfection. She had met James during his residency, when she worked as a nurse at the same hospital. Now she channeled that same caring nature into creating a home that felt like a sanctuary from the outside world. Emily was their only child, a thoughtful girl with her father's intelligent dark eyes and her mother's gentle disposition. She had inherited her parents' careful way of observing the world, noticing details that other children might miss. The way her mother's smile sometimes didn't quite reach her eyes when she thought no one was looking. How her father would pause in the doorway of rooms, as if listening for something only he could hear. These small observations lived in Emily's mind like collected treasures, filed away in the pink diary with the tiny brass lock that she kept hidden beneath her mattress. The diary had been a Christmas gift from her grandmother, and Emily took her writing seriously. Each evening before bed, she would carefully record the day's events in her careful third-grade handwriting. Today Max learned to shake hands, she had written just last week. Daddy says he's the smartest dog in the neighborhood. I think he's the smartest dog in the whole world. Max had arrived 2 years earlier as a surprise for Emily's 6th birthday. A small terrier puppy with brown and white fur and eyes that sparkled with mischief. He was the kind of dog that seemed to smile, his tongue lolling out in perpetual happiness, his tail wagging with such enthusiasm that his entire body wiggled along with it. From the moment Emily first held him, she knew they belonged together. Max slept curled at the foot of her bed, followed her from room to room, and seemed to understand her moods with an almost human intuition that the bond between girl and dog was something beautiful to witness. Margaret would often pause in her housework to watch them playing in the backyard, Emily's laughter mixing with Max's happy barks as they chased each other around the oak tree that dominated their small yard. James would sometimes join them after dinner, teaching Max new tricks while Emily watched with rapt attention, her small hands clapping with delight when Max successfully performed a new command. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where such simple joys felt not just possible, but inevitable. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived next door, would wave from her kitchen window each morning as Emily walked to school, Max trotting beside her to the corner where the crossing guard would ruffle his ears before sending Emily safely across. The postman, Mr. Kowalski, always carried a pocket full of dog treats, and Max would sit patiently by the mailbox each afternoon, knowing that his patience would be rewarded. It was a world built on trust and predictability, where the biggest excitement might be a new family moving in down the street or the annual neighborhood barbecue that marked the beginning of summer. The Chen family fit seamlessly into this tableau of American contentment, their presence adding to the neighborhood's carefully maintained sense of harmony and prosperity. But even in this secure environment, there were undercurrents that Emily was only beginning to sense. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear her parents talking in voices too low for her to understand the words, but something in their tone would make her stomach tighten with unnamed worry. Once she had overheard her father on the telephone using a tone she had never heard before, sharp, almost angry, before he noticed her presence, and quickly ended the call with a forced smile. Mrs. Patterson, despite her grandmotherly appearance and her habit of bringing over fresh-baked cookies, had a way of asking questions that seemed to probe deeper than casual neighborly interest. "How is your Uncle Robert doing, dear?" She had asked Emily just last month, her pale blue eyes watching Emily's face carefully. "I haven't seen him visiting lately." Emily had answered truthfully that she didn't know, that Uncle Robert only visited sometimes, but something in Mrs. Patterson's expression suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Uncle Robert was her father's younger brother, a man who appeared sporadically in their lives like a charming but unreliable comet. When he visited, he brought laughter and excitement, his pockets always filled with small gifts, and his stories full of adventure and humor. But Emily had begun to notice that these visits often ended with hushed, serious conversations between the brothers, and that her father's mood would remain subdued for days afterward. The house on Elm Street had 4 bedrooms, though one served as her father's study, lined with medical journals and the serious-looking books he sometimes read late into the evening. Emily's room was decorated in soft pastels, with curtains her mother had sewn by hand and a bookshelf filled with the adventures that fueled her imagination. The living room centered around a television console that brought the outside world into their controlled environment, though her parents carefully monitored what programs she was allowed to watch. The kitchen was Margaret's domain, where she prepared meals with the same precision her husband used in treating his young patients. The breakfast table by the window looked out onto their backyard, where Emily and Max spent countless hours playing and exploring. It was a view that represented security and happiness, a private world where nothing bad could penetrate. This was the foundation of Emily's universe, solid, predictable, and safe. Her days followed comforting patterns. Breakfast with her parents before school, afternoons playing with Max while her mother prepared dinner, evenings spent doing homework at the kitchen table while delicious smells filled the air. Bedtime stories, weekend family outings, and the gentle rhythm of a life carefully constructed to provide everything a growing child might need. Yet, beneath this surface of domestic tranquility, there were small signs that Emily's young mind was beginning to register, even if she couldn't yet interpret their meaning. The way certain phone calls would make her father's jaw tighten. How her mother sometimes stared out the window with an expression that seemed far away and worried. The fact that Uncle Robert's visits had become less frequent, and when he did come, the adults would speak in voices that carried undertones of concern and frustration. Max, in his innocent animal wisdom, seemed to sense these subtle tensions too. Sometimes Emily would catch him sitting perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to sounds she couldn't hear. His protective instincts around her had grown stronger over the past few months, and while her parents attributed this to his natural loyalty, Emily wondered if there was something more. The neighborhood itself felt different lately, though Emily couldn't quite put her finger on how. Cars she didn't recognize would sometimes drive slowly down Elm Street, their occupants hidden behind tinted windows. Mrs. Patterson had taken to keeping her curtains drawn more often during the day, and even the mailman seemed less inclined to linger and chat during his rounds. These changes were subtle enough that an adult might have dismissed them as imagination, but Emily's observant nature caught details that others might miss. She stored these observations in her mind alongside her diary entries, puzzle pieces that didn't yet form a complete picture, but suggested that something was shifting in her carefully ordered world. As January melted into February, Emily would look back on this time as the last period of true innocence in her young life. These were the final days when her biggest worry was whether Max would remember the new trick they had been practicing, when her parents' hushed conversations seemed like nothing more than boring adult business, and when the idea that someone might want to hurt her family was as foreign as the possibility that the sun might not rise the next morning. The warmth of their home, the security of their routine, and the unconditional love that surrounded her created a cocoon of safety that Emily took for granted the way children do, completely and without question. She had no way of knowing that this precious sense of security was about to be shattered, or that the lessons she would learn in the coming days would reshape her understanding of love, trust, and the complex ways that adults protect the children they cherish most. In her diary that Tuesday evening, the last entry she would make before everything changed, Emily wrote, "Max was extra good today. He sat by the door, waiting for Daddy to come home, like he always does. When Daddy's car pulled into the driveway, Max's tail started wagging so hard I thought he might fly away. I love how happy Max gets when our family is all together. I think dogs know when everything is perfect, even when we don't notice it ourselves." She had no way of knowing that by the next evening, Max would be gone, and that perfect world would begin to crack in ways that would take years to understand and a lifetime to forgive. Tuesday morning dawned gray and bitter, the kind of February day that made even the hardiest souls want to stay bundled beneath warm blankets. Emily woke to the familiar sounds of her father preparing for work, the gentle thud of his medical bag being set by the door, the soft murmur of her parents' morning conversation drifting up from the kitchen. But when she reached down to pet Max, expecting to feel his warm, sleeping form curled at the foot of her bed, her hand found only empty space. "Max," she called softly, sitting up and scanning her room. Sometimes he wandered downstairs early, drawn by the smell of bacon or the hope of catching crumbs from her father's toast. She padded to the window and looked out at the backyard, thinking perhaps he had asked to go outside, but the snow lay unmarked by paw prints. Downstairs, her parents were at the breakfast table, her father reading the morning paper while her mother poured coffee into his favorite blue mug. Neither looked particularly concerned, which eased Emily's worry as she entered the kitchen. "Have you seen Max?" she asked, accepting the glass of orange juice her mother handed her. "He was restless last night," her father said, looking up from him. "His paper. Your mother let him out into the backyard around midnight. He probably found a comfortable spot to sleep outside. But when they opened the back door to call him in for breakfast, Max didn't come bounding across the yard as he always did. Margaret frowned, stepping onto the small back porch despite the cold. "Max, come here, boy." The silence that answered felt different from Max's occasional games of hide and seek. This was an empty silence, one that made Emily's stomach clench, with the first stirrings of real worry. "Maybe he's in the front yard," Emily suggested. Though Max rarely ventured beyond their fenced backyard on his own, they checked anyway, calling his name up and down Elm Street, while neighbors paused in their morning routines to watch Mrs. Patterson appeared at her front door, wrapped in a thick bathrobe. "Is everything all right, dear?" "Max seems to have wandered off," Margaret explained, her voice carefully controlled. "Have you seen him this morning?" The elderly woman's expression shifted in a way that Emily couldn't quite interpret. "No, I haven't seen him since yesterday afternoon." "But you know how dogs can be, probably just chasing a squirrel or exploring somewhere new." Emily's father had to leave for work despite the growing concern. "He'll turn up," he assured Emily, kissing the top of her head. "Dogs have excellent homing instincts. He's probably just having an adventure." But Max had never had an adventure. That lasted past breakfast time. He was a creature of habit, as devoted to routine as any member of the Chen family. His morning ritual was sacred wake up with Emily, follow her downstairs, sit patiently by his food bowl while breakfast was prepared, then spend the morning napping in the sunny spot by the living room. Window.school became an exercise in distraction that Emily could barely endure. Every sound in the hallway made her hope it might somehow be news about Max. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed her distracted state and gently asked if everything was all right at home. Emily explained about Max's disappearance and the kind woman promised to keep an eye out during her own walk home that afternoon. The walk home from school felt endless. Emily's eyes scanned every yard, every alley, every possible hiding spot where a small terrier might take shelter. She called Max's name until her throat felt raw, pausing at every corner to listen for the sound of familiar barking. Other children from the neighborhood joined the search, creating an impromptu expedition to comb through Maplewood Heights with the thoroughness that only children possess. "Maybe he went to the park," suggested Tommy Morrison from 2 streets over. "My dog goes there sometimes when he gets loose." They searched the small neighborhood park where Emily often took Max to play fetch. They looked behind the community center, around the elementary school, and in the wooded area that bordered their subdivision. As the afternoon wore on and the temperature dropped, the volunteer search party gradually dwindled as children were called home for dinner. Margaret had spent her own day making phone calls to the animal shelter, to the veterinarian's office, to anyone who might have information about a missing dog. When Emily arrived home with tears frozen on her cheeks and no Max trotting beside her, mother and daughter looked at each other with the kind of shared worry that needed no words. "We'll find him," Margaret said, pulling Emily into a hug that smelled of the perfume she wore and the faint scent of the apple pie she had baked to keep herself busy. "Dogs are smart, and Max is one of the smartest. He knows where he belongs." That evening, Dr. Chen came home to a house that felt wrong without Max's enthusiastic greeting at the door. The 3 of them ate dinner in unusual quiet, the empty spot where Max's food bowl usually sat seeming to grow larger as the meal progressed. Emily pushed food around her plate, her appetite gone along with her dog. "Can we make posters?" she asked suddenly. "With Max's picture? Maybe someone found him and they just don't know where he lives." Her parents exchanged a look that Emily didn't understand, something that passed between them too quickly for her to interpret, but that carried weight and meaning. "That's a very good idea," her father said finally. "We'll work on them tonight." They spent the evening at the kitchen table, Emily carefully drawing pictures of Max while her mother typed a description on her small portable typewriter. Missing. Small brown and white terrier, answers to Max. Much loved family pet. Please. Call if found. They included their phone number and the promise of a reward, though Emily couldn't imagine what reward could possibly equal having Max home safe. Wednesday brought a new kind of routine built around absence. Emily woke hoping the previous day had been a nightmare, that she would find Max in his usual spot at the foot of her bed. The empty space felt like a physical ache. She helped her mother tape the missing dog posters to telephone poles and bulletin boards around the neighborhood, each one a small paper plea for Max's safe return. The phone rang several times throughout the day, raising hopes that were quickly dashed. A woman thought she had seen a dog matching Max's description 3 neighborhoods over, but when they drove to investigate, it turned out to be a different terrier entirely. A man called to report finding a dog collar in his yard, but it wasn't. Max's familiar red leather collar with his name tag jingling cheerfully. School on Wednesday was even more difficult than Tuesday had been. Emily's concentration was completely shattered, and she found herself staring out the classroom window, hoping to catch a glimpse of a small brown and white form that never appeared. Her teacher allowed her to call home during lunch to check if there had been any news. There hadn't been. By Wednesday evening, the reality of Max's disappearance had settled over the Chen household like a heavy blanket. Emily's father sat in his favorite chair, reading medical journals, but clearly not concentrating on the words. Her mother moved through her evening routine with mechanical precision, but Emily noticed the way she paused sometimes, as if listening for the sound of Max's nails clicking on the hardwood floors. Thursday morning brought snow large, soft flakes that would have delighted Emily under normal circumstances. She and Max loved playing in fresh snow, and some of her happiest memories involved watching him leap through drifts that came up to his belly, his whole body disappearing except for the tip of his tail wagging frantically above the white surface. Now, the snow only made everything worse. If Max was outside somewhere, lost and alone, he would be cold and frightened. Emily pressed her face against her bedroom window, watching the flakes fall and feeling helpless in a way she had never experienced before. Her 8-year-old heart couldn't comprehend a world where Max might not come home, but with each passing hour, that possibility became harder to ignore. The neighborhood search efforts continued, but with less enthusiasm as the weather worsened. Mrs. Patterson invited Emily in for hot chocolate Thursday afternoon, and as they sat in her warm kitchen, Emily found herself studying the older woman's face for clues she couldn't name. Sometimes, Mrs. Patterson said carefully, stirring her own cup of cocoa, things happen that are difficult for children to understand. Adults have to make choices that might seem strange, but they're usually trying to protect the people they love. Emily didn't understand what Mrs. Patterson meant, but something in her tone made the hot chocolate taste less sweet. "Do you think Max is okay?" she asked. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a long moment, her pale blue eyes looking past Emily toward the window. "I think," she said finally, "that some situations are more complicated than they appear on the surface. But I also think that love has a way of making things work out, even when we can't see how." That night, Emily lay in her bed listening to the wind howl outside her window. Her parents' voices drifted up from downstairs, not the comfortable murmur of normal evening conversation, but something more urgent and hushed. She caught fragments of words that made no sense to her. Message, warning, can't let this continue. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of Max wandering through snow-covered streets looking for home. In her dreams, she could hear him barking, calling for her, but she could never find him no matter how hard she searched. Friday arrived gray and bitter, marking 3 full days since Max had disappeared. Emily woke with the hollow feeling that was becoming familiar, the immediate recognition that something essential was missing from her world. She had stopped expecting to find Max at the foot of her bed, but the hope died fresh each morning anyway. It was Friday evening, as Emily sat at the kitchen table attempting homework she couldn't concentrate on when she heard a sound that made her heart stop. A scratching at the front door, tentative, weak, but unmistakably familiar. The sound of claws against wood that she had heard thousands of times before. "Max?" she whispered, hardly daring to hope. The scratching came again, followed by the faintest whimper. Emily flew from her chair and raced to the front door, her parents close behind her. When she pulled it open, the sight that greeted them would be burned into Emily's memory forever. Max sat on their front porch, shivering violently, his usually bright eyes dull with exhaustion and something that looked disturbingly like fear. His brown and white fur was matted and dirty, and he seemed smaller somehow, as if the 3 days away had diminished him in ways that went beyond mere weight loss. But he was alive, and he was home. Emily dropped to her knees and gathered him into her arms, feeling his small body trembling against her chest. His tail wagged weakly, but it was his tail, and he was pressing his cold nose against her neck in a way that meant he had missed her, just as desperately as she had missed him. "Oh, Max," she whispered, tears of relief streaming down her face. "Oh, my sweet boy, you came home." Emily carried Max inside, wrapping him in her favorite winter coat, the red wool one with the big buttons that her grandmother had sent for Christmas. He felt different in her arms, not just thinner, but somehow fragile in a way that Max had never been before. His usual enthusiastic wiggling was replaced by a quiet stillness that made Emily's chest tight with worry. "Let me examine him," her father said gently, setting his medical bag on the coffee table. Emily was reluctant to let go of Max, but she trusted her father's healing hands more than anyone else in the world. Dr. Chen's voice took on the calm, professional tone he used with his young patients as he carefully felt along Max's small body, checking for injuries with the same thorough attention he gave to the children in his practice. "No broken bones," he murmured, his skilled fingers working their way over Max's ribs and legs. "He's dehydrated and underweight, but nothing that can't be remedied with food, water, and rest." But Emily noticed the way her father's jaw tightened slightly as he examined Max's paws, and how his eyes lingered on marks in the dog's fur that Emily couldn't quite see from her position on the couch. Margaret had already prepared a bowl of warm water and Max's favorite food, but when they offered it to him, he approached hesitantly, so unlike the Max who usually dove into his meals with joyful enthusiasm. He drank the water gratefully, but ate only a few bites before retreating to the corner of the living room, where he settled with his back against the wall and his eyes fixed on the front door. "He's just tired," Emily's mother said, but her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "It's been a difficult few days for him." Emily knelt beside Max, stroking his matted fur with gentle fingers. "Where were you, boy?" she whispered. "What happened to you?" Max looked up at her with those familiar brown eyes, but something had changed in them. Where once there had been uncomplicated joy and trust, Emily now saw something that looked disturbingly like wariness. It was the expression of a creature who had learned that the world could be less safe than he had believed. That evening, as Emily's parents thought she was asleep, she crept to the top of the stairs and listened to their hushed conversation in the living room below. The words drifted up in fragments that painted an incomplete but troubling picture. "Sending a message," her father's voice, tight with anger. "Can't prove anything," her mother, sounding frustrated. "Robert needs to understand what this could lead to. Emily can never know." Emily's 8-year-old mind struggled to make sense of these pieces. Who was sending a message? And what did Uncle Robert have to do with Max being missing? She pressed herself closer to the banister, straining to hear more. But her parents had moved their conversation to the kitchen, their voices becoming an indistinct murmur that carried worry in its tone, even when the words were unclear. The next morning brought Uncle Robert to their door, arriving earlier than he had ever visited before. Emily was finishing her breakfast when she heard his familiar voice in the hallway, but something was different about it, rougher, more strained than usual. When he entered the kitchen, Emily noticed that his normally cheerful demeanor seemed forced, like a smile painted over something darker. "Hey there, sunshine," he said to Emily, ruffling her hair with hands that shook slightly. "I heard Max had quite an adventure." Emily nodded, glancing toward the living room where Max was still keeping his distance from strangers, something he had never done before Uncle Robert's visits. "He came home last night, but he's acting funny. Dad says he's just tired." Uncle Robert's eyes met her father's over Emily's head, and again Emily sensed that adult communication happening in a language she couldn't decipher. "Dogs are resilient," Uncle Robert said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "He'll be back to normal in no time." Emily excused herself to check on Max, but she lingered in the hallway, listening as the adult conversation continued in the kitchen. Uncle Robert's voice had lost all pretense of cheerfulness now, replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. "They made their point, James." Message received, loud and clear. "But involving a child's pet, that's crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed. The line was crossed the moment you got involved with those people." Her father replied, his voice harder than Emily had ever heard it. "This is what happens when debts go unpaid, Robert. This is what they do to apply pressure." "I'm handling it," Uncle Robert said. "I just need more time." "Time isn't something we have much of," her mother interjected, her usual gentleness replaced by steel. "Not when they're willing to target Emily indirectly." "What comes next, Robert? What escalation are you putting our family at risk for?" Emily's hands trembled as she processed these words. Debts? Pressure? People who would take a little girl's dog to send a message. The safe world she had always known suddenly felt less certain, as if the foundation beneath her feet had developed cracks she was just beginning to notice when Uncle Robert left. An hour later, Emily watched from her bedroom window as he walked to his car with shoulders that seemed to carry a weight heavier than his slight frame should bear. Her father stood in the doorway, and even from upstairs, Emily could see the tension in his posture, the way he gripped the doorframe as if anchoring himself against forces she couldn't see. That afternoon, Dr. Chen came home from work earlier than usual, his medical bag forgotten in the car as he hurried into the house. Emily was in the living room with Max, who had finally allowed her to brush some of the tangles from his fur, when she heard her parents' voices rise in what sounded like the beginning of an argument. "We need to consider our options," her father was saying. "This can't continue." "If they're willing to, lower your voice," her mother interrupted sharply. Emily doesn't need to hear this. But Emily had already heard enough to know that whatever was happening was bigger than Max's disappearance, bigger than Uncle Robert's problems, bigger than anything her 8-year-old mind had ever had to grapple with. She buried her face in Max's fur, breathing in his familiar scent and trying to recapture the simple safety she had felt just a week ago. Max seemed to sense her distress. For the first time since his return, he pressed closer to her, his small body warm against her side. His tail gave a tentative wag, and Emily felt a spark of hope that maybe, with enough love and patience, everything could return to the way it had been before. But even as she held him close, she couldn't shake the feeling that some fundamental change had occurred not just in Max, but in the entire fabric of her family's life. The adults around her were carrying secrets that cast shadows over their usual warmth, and Emily was beginning to understand that growing up might mean learning truths she wasn't sure she wanted to know. That evening, as Margaret tucked Emily into bed, her daughter finally voiced the question that had been building all day. "Mom, why would someone take Max?" Margaret's hand stilled in Emily's hair, and for a moment, Emily saw something flash across her mother's face: pain, anger, and something that looked like fear. Then the familiar mask of parental protection settled back into place. Sometimes, Margaret said carefully, people make poor choices that affect innocent creatures. But the important thing is that Max is home now, safe with people who love him. But what if they try to take him again? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Emily was only beginning to grasp. Margaret leaned down and kissed her forehead, her lips lingering as if she could somehow transfer safety and certainty through that simple gesture. "Your father and I will make sure that doesn't happen," she said firmly. "You don't need to worry about grown-up problems, sweetheart. That's what parents are for." But as Margaret turned off the bedroom light and Emily lay in the darkness, listening to Max's quiet breathing from his spot on the floor beside her bed, he was still too nervous to sleep on the bed itself. She knew that her childhood trust in her parents' ability to control the world around them had been shaken in ways that might never fully heal. Outside her window, the wind rattled the bare branches of the oak tree, and Emily pulled her blankets closer around herself, wishing she could pull them over her entire family and keep them all safe from whatever forces had reached into their peaceful world and stolen 3 days of their happiness. In the distance, she could hear her parents' voices continuing their worried conversation, the sound carrying the weight of decisions and fears that Emily sensed would reshape their lives in ways she was only beginning to understand. The next morning, Emily discovered the crumpled piece of paper while helping her mother empty the wastebaskets, a chore that had never seemed important before, but now felt like detective work. The paper had been torn and hastily discarded, but Emily's sharp eyes caught sight of unfamiliar handwriting, peeking out from beneath coffee grounds and tissues. While her mother was distracted with sorting laundry, Emily carefully extracted the paper and smoothed it out on her bedroom floor. The words were written in block letters, harsh and angular, so different from her father's careful script or her mother's flowing cursive. Most of the words were too difficult for her third-grade reading level, but certain phrases jumped out. With frightening clarity, final warning, and next time won't be so lucky, and debts must be paid. Emily's heart hammered as she stared at the paper, understanding instinctively that this was connected to Max's disappearance, even though she couldn't grasp the full meaning. The tone of the message made her stomach feel cold and hollow, the way it did when she watched scary movies through her fingers. But this wasn't a movie she could turn off or a book she could close. This was something real that had invaded her family's life. She folded the paper carefully and hid it in her diary, between pages where she had written about happier times with Max. Having the physical evidence somehow made the threat feel more real and more manageable, at the same time proof that her growing fears weren't just imagination, but also something concrete that adults might be able to fight against. That afternoon brought another unexpected visitor. Emily was in the backyard with Max, trying to coax him to play fetch, when she saw her parents through the kitchen window, their postures rigid with tension as they spoke to a man she didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat that made him seem to blend into the gray February afternoon. Even from a distance, Emily could see that this wasn't a social call. Max had been making gradual progress, his appetite returning and his willingness to venture beyond the corners of rooms slowly increasing. But at the sight of the stranger, through the window, he immediately pressed against Emily's legs, a low whine escaping his throat. His reaction told Emily everything she needed to know about the nature of their visitor. She led Max around to the front of the house, planning to enter through the front door, but stopped when she heard voices carrying from the partially open kitchen window. "Understand that this is a delicate situation," the stranger was saying, his voice smooth but carrying undertones that made Emily think of ice over deep water. "Mr. Chen's brother has been given ample opportunity to address his obligations. My brother's problems are not my family's responsibility," her father replied, but Emily heard the strain in his voice and involving my daughter's pet crosses a line that should never have been crossed. Lines have a way of shifting when cooperation is lacking, the man said. We hoped that a gentle reminder might encourage more productive conversations. The animal was unharmed, was it not? Emily's breath caught. This man was talking about Max as if he were just an object, a tool to be used. The casual cruelty in his tone made her wrap her arms more tightly around Max, who was trembling again. What do you want? Her mother asked, her voice barely controlled. Simply, this Dr. Chen seems to be a man who values his family's security. Perhaps he can help his brother understand the importance of honoring commitments. Time is running short, and our patience, while considerable, is not infinite. Emily heard footsteps moving toward the front of the house and quickly led Max around to the backyard again, her mind racing. By the time her parents found her there, she was sitting on the back steps with Max in her lap, trying to look as if she had been there all along. Who was that man? She asked, affecting the casual curiosity of a child who hadn't overheard anything she shouldn't have. Just someone with business to discuss with your father, her mother said, but her hands were shaking slightly as she smoothed Emily's hair. Nothing for you to worry about. But Emily was worrying more than she had ever worried about anything in her 8 years. That evening, she lay in bed listening to her parents' urgent whispers carrying through the heating vents, catching fragments that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Can't keep putting Emily at risk. Robert has to face this himself. Might need to consider other arrangements. The phrase other arrangements sent a chill through Emily that had nothing to do with the February cold. What kind of arrangements? Did her parents think they might need to send her away somewhere? The thought of being separated from Max, especially now when he was still recovering, filled her with panic. The next few days brought a subtle but unmistakable change in the household routine. Her father began checking the locks on all the doors and windows each night, something he had never done before. Her mother started walking Emily to school instead of letting her make the familiar journey alone, claiming she enjoyed the exercise but glancing nervously at cars that lingered too long at stop signs. Uncle Robert visited again, but this time Emily noticed that he looked thinner, his usually neat appearance slightly disheveled. His conversation with her parents took place entirely in hushed tones, and when Emily tried to approach, her mother quickly found tasks to keep her occupied in other parts of the house. Max's recovery continued, but his personality had shifted in ways that broke Emily's heart. The joyful, trusting dog who had bounded through life with infectious enthusiasm had been replaced by a more cautious creature who startled at unexpected sounds and always positioned himself between Emily and strangers. He had learned wariness in a way that no dog should have to learn it. Mrs. Patterson seemed to be watching their house more frequently, her pale blue eyes tracking visitors and lingering at her window during times when nothing particularly interesting should be happening in the neighborhood. When Emily mentioned this to her mother, Margaret's expression tightened in a way that suggested Mrs. Patterson's vigilance wasn't entirely unwelcome. Some neighbors are just naturally observant, her mother said carefully. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have people looking out for each other. Emily was beginning to understand that adults spoke in code when topics became too serious or frightening for children to handle directly. Every conversation seemed to have layers of meaning beneath the surface words, and she was starting to develop the skill of listening not just to what was said, but to what was carefully not said. The realization that her parents were protecting her from something significant brought a mixture of gratitude and frustration. She appreciated their desire to shield her from adult problems, but she was also beginning to chafe against the barriers they erected around information she felt she needed to understand. How could she help keep Max safe if she didn't know what they were protecting him from? One evening, as she sat in the living room supposedly reading while actually watching her parents' tense conversation in the kitchen, Emily made a decision that would have surprised her just a week earlier. She was going to find out what was really happening even if the adults in her life thought she was too young to understand. She started by paying more attention to things she had previously dismissed as boring grown-up business. Phone conversations. That stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Mail that her father read with particular intensity before quickly filing away. The way certain topics caused immediate subject changes when she appeared. Max seemed to sense her new determination and began following her even more closely than usual, as if he understood that they were all eyes in a world that had become less predictable. Together, they began to notice patterns, cars that appeared on their street with suspicious frequency, phone calls that came at odd hours, the way her father's jaw tightened when certain names were mentioned, Emily's diary entries. During this period reflected her growing awareness that childhood innocence was slipping away whether she was ready for it or not. Today, I realize that adults don't always tell children the truth, she wrote one evening. They think they're protecting us, but sometimes not knowing makes everything scarier. Max knows something bad happened to him, but he can't tell me what it was. I wish dogs could talk, or that grown-ups trusted kids more. The threatening note hidden in her diary seemed to grow heavier each day, physical proof that her family was caught up in something dangerous and complex. Emily found herself taking it out regularly, studying the harsh handwriting and trying to decode the adult fears hidden in those angular letters. As February drew toward its close, Emily began to understand that the life she had known safe, predictable, insulated from the dark currents of the adult world, was gone forever. In its place was something more complicated, where love meant making difficult decisions and where protecting the people you cared about sometimes required deception and sacrifice. The knowledge sat heavily on her 8-year-old shoulders, but it also brought a strange kind of strength. She was no longer a child who could be completely shielded from reality. And with that loss of innocence came a new determination to be worthy of the trust her parents hadn't yet realized they needed to place in her. The truth about Uncle Robert came in pieces, like a puzzle Emily was assembling without knowing what the final picture would reveal. The first significant piece fell into place on a Saturday morning when she discovered her father sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a small gold object that caught the morning light streaming through the window. "What's that, Daddy?" Emily asked, settling into her usual chair with a bowl of cereal. Her father quickly closed his fingers around the object, but not before Emily caught a glimpse of an ornate watch face. "Just something that belonged to your Uncle Robert," he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to such a simple question. "Why do you have Uncle Robert's watch?" The pause that followed felt heavy with unspoken implications. Emily had become skilled at reading these adult silences, understanding that they often contained more information than the words that eventually followed them. "He asked me to hold on to it for safekeeping," her father said finally. But Emily noticed the way his fingers tightened around the watch, as if he were gripping something more valuable than mere metal and glass. Later that morning, while her parents thought she was playing with Max in the backyard, Emily overheard a phone conversation that provided more pieces to the puzzle she was unconsciously building. The watch was his grandfather's, her father was saying to someone on the other end of the line. "It's been in the family for 3 generations. The fact that he was willing to pawn, it tells you everything you need to know about how desperate the situation has become." Pawn. Emily had heard the word before, but hadn't fully understood its meaning until that moment. Uncle Robert had sold his precious watch, a family heirloom, for money. Money he needed for something so urgent that he was willing to sacrifice a piece of family history. The conversation continued, and Emily pressed closer to the slightly open kitchen window, Max sitting alertly beside her as if he too understood the importance of what they were learning. "Gambling debts are one thing," her father continued, "but when organized crime gets involved, the stakes change completely. These aren't people who accept payment plans or show mercy for family circumstances. They use fear as their primary collection method, and they've already demonstrated their willingness to target innocent parties. Emily's blood felt cold in her veins. Organized crime. She had heard those words in movies and television shows, always associated with dangerous men who hurt people who couldn't pay what they owed. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made her stomach churn with fear. For Uncle Robert, and anger at the situation he had created for their family. Robert claims he can handle it, but his track record for handling anything responsibly is somewhat lacking, her father said, his voice hardening with frustration. Meanwhile, my daughter's dog gets used as a warning message, and I'm supposed to just stand by and watch while this escalates. Emily's hands clenched into fists. Max's disappearance hadn't been random or accidental. It had been a deliberate act of intimidation, designed to pressure her family into forcing Uncle Robert to pay money he owed to very dangerous people. The casual cruelty of using a child's beloved pet as a threat made her feel sick with rage. The phone conversation ended, and Emily remained crouched by the window, her mind racing as she tried to process everything she had learned. Max pressed against her side, and she realized that he had become not just her companion, but her fellow victim in this adult drama she hadn't chosen to be part of. That afternoon brought Uncle Robert himself, arriving with the kind of nervous energy that Emily was beginning to recognize as his default state. But this time, she watched him with new eyes, seeing past his usual cheerful demeanor to the anxiety that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a fever. "How's my favorite niece?" he asked, but his smile seemed forced, and Emily noticed the way his hands shook slightly as he ruffled her hair. "I'm your only niece," Emily replied, the same response she always gave to his familiar greeting. But this time, she studied his face more carefully, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting someone unwelcome to appear. Uncle Robert spent most of his visit in intense conversation with her parents. Their voices kept deliberately low, but their body language speaking volumes about the stress they were all carrying. Emily occupied herself with Max, who had become increasingly protective around Uncle Robert's visits, as if he could sense the connection between this man and the trauma he had experienced. When Uncle Robert finally prepared to leave, Emily watched from her bedroom window as he spoke with her father on the front porch. Even from upstairs, she could see the way Uncle Robert's shoulders slumped with defeat, and how her father's posture remained rigid with controlled anger. "This can't continue, Robert," her father's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "My family shouldn't have to pay the price for your poor decisions." "I know," Uncle Robert replied, his voice barely audible. "I'm working on a solution. I just need a little more time." Time isn't something we have the luxury of giving you. Not when they're willing to target Emily indirectly. What happens when they decide that Max wasn't enough of a message? Emily's mother's pearl necklace disappeared on a Tuesday, though Emily didn't notice its absence until Thursday evening when she was helping sort the laundry. The necklace, a wedding gift from Emily's grandmother, worn every Sunday to church, and on special occasions had always rested in the small jewelry box on her parents' dresser. Now the velvet-lined compartment sat empty, leaving only the faint impression where the pearls had once nested. "Mom, where's your pearl necklace?" Emily asked that evening as her mother tucked her into bed. Margaret's hand stilled for just a moment in Emily's hair before resuming its gentle stroking. "I sent it to be restrung," she said, but her voice carried the same careful tone. Emily had learned to recognize when adults were crafting truth from fragments of larger, more complicated realities. Emily had become too observant to accept such explanations without question. The next morning, while her mother was distracted with breakfast preparations, Emily climbed onto a chair to examine the jewelry box more carefully. The other pieces, her mother's simple gold wedding band, a pair of earrings that had been Emily's, grandmother's, a small brooch shaped like a butterfly, were all present and accounted for. Only the most valuable piece was missing, The pattern was becoming clear, and Emily felt a sick understanding settle in her stomach. First Uncle Robert's gold watch, now her mother's pearls. Her family was sacrificing their most precious possessions, selling pieces of their history to help Uncle Robert, with debts that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller despite their efforts. An afternoon brought unexpected validation for Emily's growing suspicions. Mrs. Patterson invited her over for hot chocolate, and as they sat in her warm kitchen, the elderly woman's carefully casual questions revealed more than they concealed. "Your parents seem rather stressed lately, dear," Mrs. Patterson observed, stirring her cocoa with deliberate concentration. "I hope everything is all right with your family." Emily studied her neighbor's face, noting the way Mrs. Patterson's pale blue eyes watched her with an intensity that suggested genuine concern mixed with curiosity. "Uncle Robert has been visiting a lot," Emily said carefully, testing the waters. "Ah," Mrs. Patterson said, and the single syllable carried volumes of understanding. "Family can be complicated, can't it? Sometimes we love people who make choices that are difficult for everyone around them." The comment struck Emily as remarkably perceptive for someone who supposedly knew nothing about their family's troubles. "Have you ever known someone who got into trouble with bad people?" Emily asked, surprising herself with her directness. Mrs. Patterson set down her cup and looked at Emily with new seriousness. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 43 years, sweetheart. I've seen families face all kinds of challenges. Sometimes good people get caught up in situations that are bigger than they ever intended." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "The important thing to remember is that when people love each other, they find ways to protect what matters most. Your parents are very good people, Emily. They'll find a way through whatever difficulties they're facing." Emily left Mrs. Patterson's house with the uncomfortable feeling that her elderly neighbor knew more about their family crisis than she was letting on. The realization that their troubles might be visible to observant outsiders made Emily feel exposed in a way that was both embarrassing and frightening. That evening brought another crisis that shattered any remaining illusions about their situation being manageable. Emily was in her room doing homework when she heard her father's voice raised in anger. Not the controlled frustration she had grown accustomed to, but genuine fury that made her stomach clench with fear. "You did what?" Her father was shouting into the telephone. "Robert, tell me you did not just do what I think you did." Emily crept to the top of the stairs, Max following silently behind her. Her father was pacing in the kitchen. The phone cord stretched taut as he moved back and forth, like a caged animal. With a Gavagus animal. Taking money from them to pay money to them is not a solution. It's insanity. "Do you have any idea what you just committed our family to?" The pause that followed was filled with her father's heavy breathing and the sound of her mother's worried voice trying to calm him down. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a deadly quiet that was somehow more frightening than his shouting had been. "You used my name. You told them that Dr. James Chen would guarantee your new debt if you couldn't pay the old one, without consulting me, without asking my permission. You've made me responsible for money. I don't have to pay people who have already threatened my daughter." Emily's hands gripped the banister so tightly her knuckles turned white. Uncle Robert had somehow made her father responsible for his gambling debts. The adults she trusted to protect her were now trapped in the same web that had caught Uncle Robert, and it was getting tighter with each desperate attempt to escape. The conversation ended with her father slamming the phone down with enough force to make the kitchen table shake. Emily heard her mother's voice, low and urgent, trying to provide comfort and strategy in equal measure. "We need help," her mother was saying. "Real help from people who know how to handle situations like this. This is beyond what we can manage on our own." "I know," her father replied, his voice heavy with defeat. "I'll make some calls tomorrow. There have to be resources, official channels we can access." "What about Emily's safety in the meantime?" The question Emily had been dreading hung in the air like a sword suspended over their family's future. Her father's answer, when it came, changed everything she thought she knew about the lengths parents would go to protect their children. "I've been thinking about that. My sister Patricia lives 3 states away. If we can arrange for Emily to visit her for a few weeks, until this situation resolves itself." No. The word escaped Emily's lips before she could stop it, loud enough to carry down to the kitchen and alert her parents to her presence. "Emily?" her mother called. "Come down here, sweetheart." Emily descended the stairs slowly, Max at her side, her heart pounding with the knowledge that she was about to have the conversation she had been both dreading and preparing for. Her parents were waiting in the kitchen, their faces showing the strain of decisions they had hoped never to make. "How much did you hear?" her father asked gently. "Enough," Emily said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I know about Uncle Robert's gambling debts. I know about the people who took Max to send you a message. I know you've been selling your jewelry and Uncle Robert's watch to try to help him. And I know those people mention me by name." Our parents exchanged a look that carried years of parental communication in a single glance. Emily saw them recognize that their efforts to protect her innocence had become impossible to maintain. "We wanted to shield you from this," her mother said softly. "Children shouldn't have to worry about adult problems." "But I'm worrying," Emily replied. "And not knowing what's really happening makes it scarier, not better. If you send me away, how will I know if you're safe? How will I know if Max is safe?" Her father knelt down to Emily's eye level, his face showing a mixture of pride and sorrow that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. "You're braver than we gave you credit for," he said. "And you're right that you deserve to know the truth. But understanding the truth doesn't mean you have to carry the burden of solving the problem." "Maybe not," Emily said, "but it means I get to be part of deciding how we face it together. We're a family. Families stick together when things get hard." In that moment, Emily felt herself cross a threshold from childhood into something more complex and demanding. She was no longer just someone to be protected. She was becoming someone who understood that protection was a responsibility shared by everyone who loved each other. The conversation that followed was the most honest her family had ever shared, filled with difficult truths and uncertain futures, but also with the kind of love that grows stronger when tested by adversity. Emily learned that growing up sometimes meant accepting responsibilities you hadn't asked for, but that facing those responsibilities alongside people who loved you was what made the burden bearable. As she went to bed that night, Emily knew that her childhood was ending not with a celebration of milestones reached, but with the quiet recognition that some knowledge, once gained, changed you forever. But she also knew that her family would face whatever came next together, and that knowledge gave her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The photograph fell out of Uncle Robert's coat pocket on Sunday morning, fluttering to the kitchen floor like a fallen leaf that would change everything Emily thought she knew about her family's crisis. It was an old picture, the kind with white borders and slightly faded colors that suggested it had been taken years ago. Emily picked it up automatically, meaning to hand it back to her uncle, but stopped when she recognized the young man in military uniform staring back at her. Uncle Robert looked different in the photograph, younger, obviously, but also straighter. Somehow, his shoulders squared with a confidence and purpose that Emily had never seen in the nervous, defeated man who had been visiting their house. He was standing next to what appeared to be a military transport vehicle, and in the background, Emily could make out other soldiers and what looked like an official military installation. "Uncle Robert," she said, holding up the photograph. "You were in the army?" The effect of her words on the adults in the room was immediate and dramatic. Uncle Robert went pale, reaching for the photograph with hands that shook more violently than usual. Her father's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, and her mother made a small sound that might have been surprise or dismay. "That was a long Time ago, Uncle Robert said. His voice strained as he took the photograph and quickly tucked it back into his coat. Ancient history. But Emily had become too skilled at reading adult evasions to accept such a dismissive response. Why didn't you ever tell me you were a soldier? The silence that followed felt heavy with significance. Emily watched her parents exchange a look that seemed to communicate volumes, and she realized that this was another piece of information that had been deliberately kept from her. Some experiences are difficult to talk about, her father said. Carefully. Your uncle served his country, but military service can involve situations that are better left in the past. Emily's mind was racing. Uncle Robert had been a soldier, but that part of his life had been hidden from her so completely that she had never even suspected it. Why would military service be something shameful or secret? Unless ... quotes, what kind of situations? She pressed. Her detective instincts fully engaged now. Uncle Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. I should go, he said. This isn't the time for ancient history lessons. But as he moved toward the door, Emily noticed something. That made her heart skip a beat. In his haste to leave, Uncle Robert had forgotten his coat, and as he walked away, Emily caught sight of something tucked into the inside pocket. Not just a photograph, but what looked like official papers, documents with letterheads she couldn't quite read from her position at the kitchen table. Her father followed Uncle Robert to the front door, and Emily strained to hear their hushed conversation in the hallway. Fragments drifted back to her. Can't keep running from this. And they know about the witness protection inquiry, and most chilling of all, not just about gambling anymore, witness protection. The phrase hit Emily like a physical blow. Uncle Robert had been involved in something during his military service that was serious enough to require witness protection. The gambling debts, the dangerous people collecting money, Max's kidnapping. It was all connected to something much bigger and more complex than she had imagined. When her father returned to the kitchen, Emily was waiting with questions she was no longer willing to have deflected or dismissed. Dad, what's witness protection? Her father sank into his chair as if the weight of secrets had become too heavy to carry while standing. It's a program that helps people who have witnessed crimes testify safely by giving them new identities and relocating them away from danger. And Uncle Robert was a witness to a crime? Another of those meaningful looks passed between her parents before her father nodded slowly. During his military service, Robert witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. Something involving people who had a lot to lose if he ever talked about it. Emily's mind was reeling as the pieces of the puzzle rearranged themselves into a completely different picture. So the gambling debts were a cover story, her mother said quietly. Robert never had a gambling problem. The people threatening him aren't loan sharks collecting gambling debts. They're criminals who want to. Make sure he never testifies about what he saw. The revelation hit Emily with the force of physical impact. Everything she had been told about Uncle Robert's problems, everything she had believed about the reasons for their family's crisis, had been a carefully constructed lie designed to protect her from a truth that was far more dangerous and complex. But why lie about it? Emily asked, though part of her already understood the answer. Because, her father said gently, telling an 8-year-old that her uncle witnessed a military crime and is being hunted by people who kill witnesses seemed like information that would only frighten you without helping the situation. Emily felt a surge of anger at the deception, followed immediately by understanding of why it had been necessary. Her parents had been trying to protect her from the knowledge that Uncle Robert's life was in genuine danger, not from loan sharks who might break his legs, but from people who would kill him to keep him quiet. What did he see? Emily asked. Her father shook his head. That's not something we can tell you, sweetheart. It's not something we know many details about ourselves. Robert has been very careful about what information he shares, even with family. But the people who took Max They weren't trying to collect gambling money. They were trying to scare Uncle Robert into staying quiet about whatever he witnessed. Yes, her mother said simply. And when threatening Robert directly didn't work, they decided to apply pressure through the people he cares about, us. Emily felt sick as the full implications of this revelation settled over her. Max had been kidnapped, not as collateral for debt collection, but as a warning to a potential witness in what was probably a very serious criminal case. Her family had been drawn into something that was part of the justice system, part of a larger effort to hold dangerous people accountable for crimes they had committed. Is Uncle Robert going to testify? She asked. We don't know, her father admitted. He's been wrestling with that decision for months. Testifying would mean entering witness protection, permanently new identity, new location, cutting all ties with his old life, including with us. But not testifying means these people will keep threatening our family. That's one possibility, her mother said carefully. Or they might decide that after all this time, the threat has passed and they can leave him alone. There's no way to know for certain. Emily sat in stunned silence, processing the complete upheaval of everything she had believed about their situation. Uncle Robert wasn't an irresponsible gambler who had selfishly put their family at risk. He was a man caught between impossible choices, trying to protect both his own life and the family he loved. The dangerous people threatening them weren't common criminals motivated by money. They were likely organized crime figures or corrupt officials who had committed serious crimes during wartime and would kill to keep those crimes hidden, and her parents hadn't been enabling Uncle Robert's destructive behavior. They had been trying to help a family member navigate a situation where every choice carried the potential for devastating consequences. I understand why you didn't tell me the truth before, Emily said finally. But I'm glad I know now. It makes Uncle Robert's visits make more sense. He's not just scared about money. He's scared for his life. Yes, her father said. And he's scared for our lives too. That's why he keeps trying to handle this on his own. Why he doesn't want to involve us any more than necessary. But we're already involved, Emily pointed out. They already used Max to send a message. They already know who I am and where I go to school. The truth of her observation hung in the air like a challenge. Emily's family was already part of this crisis, whether they chose to be or not. The only question now was whether they would face it with the full truth or continue trying to navigate it while carrying the burden of secrets and half-explanations. You're right, her mother said. And that means we need to make some decisions about how to move forward. Real decisions, based on all the facts, not just the ones we thought were safe for you to know. Emily nodded, feeling simultaneously proud and terrified to be included in such serious family deliberations. The childhood innocence her parents had worked so hard to preserve was gone, but in its place was something more valuable: trust, honesty, and the recognition that she was capable of handling difficult truths. When the people she loved were counting on her dot, the photograph that had started this revelation was still tucked in Uncle Robert's coat pocket, a tangible reminder that the past had a way of reaching into the present with consequences no one could have predicted. But now that Emily understood the real stakes of their family's crisis, she felt ready to help them face whatever difficult decisions lay ahead. The federal agent's badge caught the afternoon light as Agent Sarah Martinez placed it carefully on the Chen family's kitchen table. The gold shield representing both hope and the gravity of their situation. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the kind of steady presence that made Emily feel safer just by being in the same room. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years helping families navigate crises exactly like theirs. Dr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, she said, including Emily in her gaze. I want you to know that we've been tracking the organization that's been threatening your family for over 2 years. Your brother's potential testimony could be the key to dismantling a network that has been operating with impunity for far too long. Emily sat between her parents, Max curled protectively at her feet, as Agent Martinez explained the larger picture that had been invisible to them throughout their ordeal. The people threatening Uncle Robert weren't just criminals trying to silence a witness. They were part of a sophisticated organization that had been systematically intimidating and eliminating anyone who might expose their wartime profiteering and subsequent cover-up. Robert witnessed a murder during his military service, Agent Martinez explained, her words careful but clear enough for Emily to understand. A fellow soldier who had discovered evidence of illegal arms sales was killed to keep him quiet. Robert saw it happen, but at the time, he was told it was an accident and that questioning the official story would be unpatriotic and dangerous. Emily's father leaned forward, his medical training making him comfortable with difficult facts that needed to be processed methodically. What changed? Why are they threatening him now, all these years later? Because we started investigating, Agent Martinez replied. Our inquiry into wartime corruption led us to several potential witnesses, including Robert. When these people learned that federal investigators were asking questions about events from Robert's unit, they decided to ensure that any potential witnesses were too frightened to cooperate. The revelation that Uncle Robert's crisis was part of a larger federal investigation reframed everything Emily thought she understood about their situation. They weren't isolated victims of random criminal activity. They were caught up in a fight for justice that involved the federal government and crimes that had been hidden for years. What happens if Uncle Robert agrees to testify? Emily asked, surprising the adults with her direct question. Agent Martinez turned to face her fully, treating Emily's question with the same seriousness she had shown her parents. If he testifies, we can offer him protection before, during, and after the trial. We can also extend protective measures to family members who might be at risk because of their relationship to him. What kind of protective measures? Emily's mother asked. That depends on the level of threat assessment. In some cases, it might mean increased police patrols in your neighborhood and regular check-ins. In more serious situations, it could involve temporary relocation until the trial is concluded and the defendants are safely in custody. Emily watched her parents process this information, seeing them weigh the relief of having official help against the disruption that such protection might bring to their lives. The safe, predictable routine of their suburban existence had already been shattered. Now they had to decide whether to rebuild it or accept that their lives might never return to what they had been before. There's something else you need to know, Agent Martinez continued. Robert's case isn't the only one we're building. We have 3 other potential witnesses, and the organization threatening your family knows it. They're becoming increasingly desperate, which makes them more dangerous, but also more likely to make mistakes that will help us apprehend them. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. If the criminals were becoming more desperate, did that mean the threats against her family would escalate? The question must have shown on her face, because Agent Martinez addressed it directly. Emily, I know this is scary, but I want you to understand that having federal protection is much safer than trying to handle this situation on your own. These people were confident when they thought they were just intimidating a single veteran who had no official support. Now they're facing the full resources of federal law enforcement, and that changes the equation significantly. That evening brought Uncle Robert for what Agent Martinez had told them might be his final decision-making conversation. Emily was allowed to participate in the family discussion, her new status as someone who knew the full truth earning her a place at the table where the most important decisions were being made. Uncle Robert looked older than Emily had ever seen him, the weight of months of fear and impossible choices etched in lines around his eyes. But there was also something different about him, a hint of the soldier he had once been, the man who had served his country and witnessed things that required courage to remember and strength to speak about. I've been running from this for 2 years, he said, his voice steadier than Emily had heard it in weeks. Every time I convinced myself that maybe they'd forgotten about me, maybe enough time had passed that they'd move on to other concerns. But taking Max proved that they'll never stop applying pressure until they're certain I'll never talk. Emily's father reached across the table and grasped his brother's hand. Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But you need to know that Emily's safety is our primary concern. If testifying is the only way to remove the threat to our family permanently, then that's what needs to happen. I know, Uncle Robert said, looking at Emily with an expression that mixed regret and determination. I never wanted to put you in danger, sweetheart. I thought I could handle this on my own. Keep the family out of it. But these people don't respect boundaries the way normal people do. Emily had been thinking about this conversation all day, preparing her own contribution to a decision that would affect all their lives. Uncle Robert, you said the soldier who was killed had found evidence of crimes. If you don't testify, those crimes just stay hidden forever, right? Uncle Robert nodded slowly. That's right. And the people who committed them continue to benefit from what they did. But if you do testify, then the bad things that happened get exposed, and the people who did them face consequences. In theory, yes. If the federal prosecutors can build a strong enough case, if juries believe the evidence, if justice works the way it's supposed to work. Emily looked around the table at the adults who had been carrying this burden without her knowledge for so long. It seems like testifying is the right thing to do, even if it's scary. Bad people shouldn't get to win just because they're willing to threaten families. The simple moral clarity of Emily's observation cut through the complex fears and calculations that had been paralyzing the adults. Uncle Robert smiled, the first genuine smile Emily had seen from him in weeks. Out of the mouths of babes, he said softly. You're right, Emily. Sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but that doesn't make it less right. The decision, once made, brought a sense of relief that surprised everyone. The uncertainty that had been eating at their family for months was finally replaced by a clear course of action. Uncle Robert would work with Agent Martinez and the federal prosecutors to provide testimony that could help bring justice for crimes that had been hidden too long. But the relief was tempered by the knowledge that the next few weeks would be the most dangerous period of all. The criminals threatening their family would likely make a final, desperate attempt to silence Uncle Robert before he could testify. Agent Martinez had warned them that this escalation was almost inevitable. They'll either try to eliminate the threat Robert represents, or they'll try to pressure him into refusing to cooperate by targeting the people he cares about most, she had explained. Either way, the next phase requires maximum vigilance and protective measures. As Emily went to bed that night, she knew that her family was entering the most dangerous period of their crisis, but also the phase that would finally lead to resolution. Uncle Robert's courage in deciding to testify had given them all a chance to reclaim their lives. But they would have to survive the criminals' final desperate actions first. Max seemed to sense the change in the household's energy. His protective instincts around Emily had intensified, and he positioned himself between her and any potential threat with the dedication of a professional bodyguard. Emily found comfort in his presence, knowing that they had both survived the worst of their ordeal and were now facing the final challenge together. The federal protection that would begin the next morning represented more than just security. It was proof that the isolated fear her family had been carrying was now shared by people whose job it was to fight against the kind of evil that had invaded their peaceful suburban life. They were no longer alone in facing forces too big and dangerous for a single family to handle. Emily fell asleep thinking about justice and courage, about the soldier who had died trying to expose crimes, and the uncle who was finally ready to honor that soldier's memory by speaking the truth, regardless of the personal cost. Tomorrow would bring federal agents and protective measures, and the beginning of the end of their long nightmare. but tonight brought the peace that comes with knowing you've chosen to do the right thing, even when it's the hardest thing. The new collar Emily had chosen for Max was bright blue with silver studs, a symbol of fresh beginnings and the promise that his days of being used as a weapon against her family were over. She fastened it around his neck on the morning that would change everything, her fingers gentle as she adjusted the fit. Max's tail wagged with something approaching his old enthusiasm, and Emily allowed herself to hope that the worst was behind them. Federal protection had arrived in the form of Agent Martinez and her partner, Agent Reynolds, along with increased police patrols that made Elm Street feel more secure than it had in months. The agents had set up a command post in the Chun's living room, their communication equipment and careful vigilance, providing the family with a sense of safety they had almost forgotten was possible. Uncle Robert had spent the previous evening with federal prosecutors, providing detailed testimony about what he had witnessed during his military service. The process had been emotionally exhausting for him, but Emily could see that speaking the truth after years of silence had lifted a weight from his shoulders that had been growing heavier each day. The prosecutors are confident they have enough evidence to proceed, Agent Martinez told Emily's family that morning. Robert's testimony, combined with forensic evidence and financial records they've been able to obtain, should be sufficient to bring charges against the primary suspects. Emily listened from her position on the living room floor, where she was playing with Max while keeping one ear tuned to the adult conversation. The knowledge that Uncle Robert's courage would lead to justice for the murdered soldier gave her a sense of satisfaction that helped counterbalance the fear of what the criminals might do in response. The phone call came at 11:30 a.m., shattering the careful calm that federal protection had created around their household. Agent Martinez answered with professional efficiency, but Emily watched her expression change as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. "We have a situation," Agent Martinez said after ending the call. "The suspects know that Robert has been cooperating with federal investigators. They've made contact with his hotel, claiming to be family members trying to reach him. Hotel security alerted us immediately, but it means they're actively looking for him." Emily's father stood up from his chair, his medical training helping him stay calm in crisis situations. "What does that mean for our safety here?" "It means they're likely to escalate their efforts to pressure him through family members," Agent Reynolds replied. "We're moving to heightened alert status, and we're arranging for additional protective resources." As if to underscore the timing of this escalation, Emily noticed a dark sedan driving slowly past their house, the same car that had made 3 passes in the last hour, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. Agent Martinez noticed it too, speaking quickly into her radio to coordinate with the patrol units positioned throughout the neighborhood. "Emily," her mother said, her voice carefully controlled, "I need you to go to your room and stay there until we tell you it's safe to come out. Take Max with you." Emily gathered Max in her arms and headed for the stairs, but she paused at the landing to listen as the agents discussed their tactical options. The fragments she caught painted a picture of criminals who were running out of time and options, making them more dangerous than they had been when they were confident they could intimidate Uncle Robert into silence. From her bedroom window, Emily could see more law enforcement vehicles arriving, unmarked cars that positioned themselves strategically around the neighborhood, and what appeared to be a SWAT team setting up several blocks away. The sight was both reassuring and terrifying, proof that the authorities were taking the threat seriously, but also evidence of how dangerous the situation had become. The confrontation began at 2:15 p.m. with a phone call to the Chen family's home. "Number." Agent Martinez answered, putting the call on speaker so that Emily's parents could hear what they were dealing with. "We know the old soldier is talking to the feds," a voice said, distorted but clearly threatening. "Tell him he has until sunset to reconsider his cooperation, or we'll show him what happens to families who don't mind their own business." "This is Agent Martinez with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she replied calmly. "You're threatening a federal witness and his family, which carries a minimum sentence of 15 years in federal prison. I'd advise you to surrender now before you make your situation worse." The laughter that came through the phone was cold and humorless. Federal protection didn't help that soldier boy who got too curious back in the day, and it won't help this family if Robert doesn't back off. The line went dead, but the message was clear. The criminals were prepared to escalate to violence if necessary, and they were no longer trying to be subtle about their intentions. Agent Martinez immediately contacted her superiors and requested additional resources. "We're dealing with suspects who have already committed murder and are prepared to do so again. I'm declaring this an imminent threat situation." Emily watched from her bedroom as the neighborhood transformed into what looked like a war zone. Federal agents took positions around their house, while police officers evacuated nearby families as a precautionary measure. Mrs. Patterson was escorted from her home by 2 officers, and Emily saw her looking back toward the Chun house with obvious worry. At 4:30 p.m., Uncle Robert arrived under heavy federal escort, his face pale but determined. Emily was allowed to come downstairs to see him, and she noticed that he was wearing the same expression she had seen in the old military photograph, the look of a soldier preparing to face danger for the sake of something larger than himself. "I'm sorry this got so bad," he told Emily, kneeling down to her level. "I never wanted you to see this kind of thing." "It's not your fault," Emily replied, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "You're trying to do the right thing. Bad people are the ones making it dangerous." Uncle Robert smiled, and Emily saw tears in his eyes. "You've grown up a lot through all this, haven't you?" Emily nodded. "I learned that sometimes doing the right thing is scary, but you have to do it anyway. And I learned that families stick together when things get hard." The moment was interrupted by Agent Martinez's urgent voice from the living room. "We have movement." 3 vehicles approaching from different directions. This is it, Emily felt. Her father's hands on her shoulders, guiding her away from the windows as the final confrontation began. Max pressed against her legs, his body tense with awareness that something significant was happening. Through the window, Emily could see the dark sedan she had noticed earlier, now joined by 2 other vehicles that were moving with obvious coordination and intent. "Stay down and stay away from windows," Agent Reynolds called out as federal agents took their positions throughout the house. "These suspects are considered armed and extremely dangerous." Emily crouched in the hallway with Max, her parents on either side of her, as the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street outside. The criminals who had terrorized her family for months were finally making their move, but this time, they weren't facing a frightened family trying to handle the situation alone. This time, they were facing the full force of federal law enforcement, and Emily felt a grim satisfaction that justice was finally within reach. The waiting was the hardest part, those tense minutes when everyone knew that violence was about to erupt, but no one knew exactly how it would unfold. Emily held Max close and thought about all the changes that had brought them to this moment. From his disappearance to the revelation about Uncle Robert's true situation to the family's decision to stand together and do the right thing regardless of the cost. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether they could finally reclaim their peaceful life or whether the criminals who had invaded their world would succeed in silencing the truth through violence and intimidation. Emily closed her eyes and held on to Max, drawing strength from his warm presence and the knowledge that they had survived everything else together. The letter Emily would write to her parents that evening was still forming in her mind as the sound of federal agents shouting commands echoed through their neighborhood. "FBI, drop your weapons and place your hands where we can see them." The words carried the authority of justice finally arriving after months of fear and uncertainty. From her position in the hallway, Emily could hear the coordinated response of law enforcement officers who had been preparing for this moment. Car doors slammed, radios crackled with urgent communications, and the careful choreography of federal arrest operation unfolded in the street outside their home. "Suspects in custody," Agent Martinez's voice called out, relief evident even in her professional tone. All 3 vehicles intercepted successfully. No shots fired. Emily felt her father's arms tighten around her in a hug that conveyed months of suppressed fear finally finding release. Her mother was crying, not the tears of sorrow that had marked so many recent days, but tears of relief that spoke to the profound emotional toll their family had endured. Uncle Robert appeared in the hallway, escorted by Agent Reynolds, his face showing a mixture of exhaustion and something that looked like peace. "It's over," he said simply. "They're in custody, and they won't be threatening anyone else." Max seemed to understand that the danger had passed. His body relaxed against Emily's legs, and for the first time in weeks, his tail wagged with genuine, uncomplicated happiness. Emily buried her face in his fur, breathing in his familiar scent and allowing herself to believe that they were finally safe. Agent Martinez entered the house, her professional demeanor softened by obvious satisfaction. "We apprehended all 3 primary suspects without incident," she reported. "They were carrying weapons and surveillance equipment, which supports the charges of conspiracy to intimidate a federal witness, combined with the evidence we already have about the original crimes. We're looking at sentences that will ensure they never threaten anyone again." Emily's father shook Agent Martinez's hand, his gratitude evident in his voice. "Thank you for protecting our family. We couldn't have gotten through this without federal support." "Thank you for having the courage to cooperate," Agent Martinez replied, looking at Uncle Robert with respect. "Witnesses like you are what make it possible to hold these people accountable for their crimes." The next hour brought a parade of official procedure statements to be given, evidence to be documented, and the careful process of transforming their family's terrifying ordeal into the legal foundation for prosecuting dangerous criminals. Emily was included in the process. Her observations about suspicious cars and threatening visitors treated as valuable evidence by investigators who understood that children often notice details that adults miss. "Emily, your attention to detail helped us establish the timeline of intimidation attempts," Agent Martinez told her as they concluded her interview. "That information will be important in demonstrating the systematic nature of the threats your family received." Emily felt proud to have contributed something useful to the investigation. But more than that, she felt the deep satisfaction that comes from seeing justice finally within reach. The people who had terrorized her family, who had used Max as a weapon of intimidation, who had murdered a soldier trying to expose their crimes, they would face consequences for their actions. That evening, after the federal agents had completed their work and the neighborhood had returned to something approaching normal, Emily sat at her small desk to write the letter that had been forming in her thoughts throughout the day's dramatic events. "Dear Mom and Dad," she began, her 3rd grade, handwriting careful and deliberate. "Today I learned something important about our family. I learned that even when you were scared, you always tried to protect me. I learned that even when you had to keep secrets, you did it because you loved me. I learned that sometimes adults have to make really hard choices, and that doing the right thing isn't always the same as doing the easy thing." She paused, thinking about Uncle Robert's courage and deciding to testify despite the personal cost, about her parents' strength in supporting him even when it put their own family at risk, about Agent Martinez and her colleagues who had chosen careers devoted to protecting people from the kind of evil that had touched their lives. "I also learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was," she continued writing. "I learned that not knowing the truth, even when it's scary, is better than not knowing. And I learned that families who love each other can get through anything if they face it together." The letter went on to express her gratitude for their honesty, once they realized she was ready to handle difficult truths. Her pride in Uncle Robert's courage and her understanding of why they had initially tried to shield her from the full reality of their situation. Most importantly, it expressed her forgiveness for the deceptions that had been necessary to protect her, and her appreciation for parents who had found the balance between safeguarding her childhood and respecting her growing maturity. When she finished writing, Emily found her parents in the living room, where Uncle Robert was sharing a quiet dinner with them for the first time in months, without the shadow of danger hanging over their conversation. The adults looked up as Emily entered, and she could see in their faces the same mixture of relief and residual stress that she was feeling herself. "I wrote you something," she said, handing the letter to her mother. "I wanted you to know that. I understand why you did what you did, and that I'm proud of our family for choosing to do the right thing even when it was hard." Her mother read the letter aloud, her voice growing thick with emotion as she worked through Emily's careful words. When she finished, both her parents were crying again, but these were different tears, expressing pride and love and the recognition that their daughter had indeed grown up significantly through their shared ordeal. "Emily," her father said, pulling her into a hug that included Uncle Robert and Max, "you've shown more courage and wisdom through this crisis than many adults would have managed. We're proud of you, and we're grateful that we faced this together as a family." Uncle Robert added his own thanks, expressing his regret for the danger his situation had brought to their family, but also his appreciation for their unwavering support. "You helped me find the courage to do the right thing," he told Emily. "Seeing how brave you were made me realize that I needed to be brave too." As the evening wound down and the family began to process the emotional aftermath of their ordeal, Emily felt a profound sense of closure. The criminals who had threatened them were in custody. Uncle Robert's testimony would help ensure justice for a murdered soldier, and their family had emerged from the crisis stronger and more honest than they had been before. Max settled into his familiar spot at the foot of Emily's bed that night, but his posture was relaxed in a way it hadn't been for weeks. His new blue collar caught the light from Emily's bedside lamp, a tangible symbol of the fresh start they were all beginning to embrace. Emily fell asleep thinking about justice and healing, about the strength that comes from facing difficult truths together, and about the kind of love that grows deeper when tested by adversity. The childhood innocence she had lost could never be fully recovered, but in its place had grown something more valuable, the knowledge that her family would always choose courage over comfort when the stakes really mattered. At 62, Emily Chen Morrison stood in her own kitchen, the morning light streaming through windows that overlooked a garden where her own grandchildren often played with dogs that carried the genetic legacy of the Max she had loved so dearly all those years ago. The simple gold band on her finger caught the light, the same wedding ring she had worn for 35 years, a symbol of the kind of love that grows stronger when built on a foundation of honesty and shared courage. The memory of that winter evening in 1965 remained as vivid as if it had happened yesterday, triggered by her 8-year-old granddaughter's tearful account of a missing cat that had thankfully returned home after just one night of absence. As Emily comforted little Sarah, she found herself thinking about Max, about Uncle Robert, about the night that taught her family the difference between protection and honesty, between safety and courage. Uncle Robert had indeed entered witness. Protection, after his testimony, led to the conviction of 3 men for murder, conspiracy, and racketeering. The trial had been front-page news for weeks, exposing a network of wartime corruption that had been hidden for years. Uncle Robert's courage in speaking the truth had not only brought justice for the murdered soldier, but it also led to investigations that exposed similar crimes in other military units. Emily had been allowed to testify as well, not about the original crime, which she had never witnessed, but about the impact of the intimidation campaign on her family. Her 8-year-old voice describing Max's kidnapping and the fear it had brought to their household had reportedly moved several jurors to tears and helped established the human cost of the defendant's attempts to silence witnesses. The last letter from Uncle Robert had arrived 5 years ago, postmarked from a city Emily couldn't identify, written in the careful, coded language that had become their family's way of staying connected despite the constraints of his new identity. He was well, he was safe, and he remained grateful for the family that had supported his decision to choose justice over personal safety. Emily kept his letters in a small wooden box, alongside the photographs and mementos that helped her remember the man who had taught her that doing the right thing sometimes required sacrificing everything you thought you wanted. Max had lived to be 15, spending his final years as the beloved patriarch of Emily's childhood home, his wariness around strangers gradually giving way to something approaching his original trusting nature. He'd been buried beneath the oak tree in their backyard, and Emily's father had carved a simple headstone that read, "Max, a good dog and a faithful friend." Emily still visited the grave when she returned to her childhood neighborhood, now a much-changed area where the old houses had been torn down and replaced by larger homes that housed new families building their own memories. Her parents had lived long, fulfilling lives, her father continuing his pediatric practice until his retirement at 70, and her mother becoming a volunteer victim advocate who helped other families navigate the justice system. They had never spoken publicly about their experience with witness intimidation, but they had channeled their understanding of fear and courage into helping others who found themselves caught between doing the right thing and protecting their families. Mrs. Patterson had turned out to be a retired intelligence analyst who had recognized the signs of organized surveillance in their neighborhood and had been quietly documenting suspicious activity to share with law enforcement if needed. Her vigilance had provided crucial evidence during the trial, and her friendship with the Chen family had deepened into the kind of bond that forms between people who have shared significant challenges. Emily's own life had been shaped in profound ways by those months of crisis and revelation. She had become a family therapist, specializing in helping families navigate situations where secrets and protection intersect with honesty and trust. Her clients often remarked on her unusual ability to understand the perspectives of both parents trying to shield their children and children who needed to be included in family decisions that affected their safety and security. Her marriage to David Morrison had been built on the principles she had learned during that difficult winter, the understanding that love sometimes requires difficult conversations, that protection without honesty is incomplete, and that families grow stronger when they face challenges together rather than trying to shield each other from hard truths. Their own children, now adults with families of their own, have been raised with age-appropriate honesty about life's complexities, but also with the security that comes from knowing that their parents would always choose their safety over comfort or convenience. Emily had tried to find a balance her own parents had struggled with, protecting her children without hiding from them the realities they needed to understand to navigate the world safely. The criminals who had terrorized her family had died in prison, their sentences long enough to ensure they never again threatened anyone's family for the sake of hiding their crimes. Agent Martinez had retired from the FBI and had stayed in touch with Emily over the years, occasionally sharing updates about cases where witness protection had made the difference between justice and impunity. Standing in her kitchen that morning, Emily reflected on the strange gift that crisis had brought to her family. The loss of childhood innocence had been painful, but it had been replaced by something more valuable. The knowledge that love was not just about comfort and safety, but about courage and honesty and the willingness to face difficult truths. Together, her granddaughter Sarah was playing in the garden now, her temporary sorrow over the missing cat forgotten in the joy of reunion and the promise that her family would always help her through whatever challenges she faced. Emily watched through the window and thought about the cycles of protection and growth that defined family love, about the way each generation learned to balance safeguarding children with preparing them for a world that would eventually require their own courage and wisdom. The winter evening when 8-year-old Emily had found Max shivering on their front porch had changed everything she thought she knew about her family and her world. But it had also taught her that even the most frightening experiences could become sources of strength when faced with love, honesty, and the determination to choose what was right over what was easy. As she prepared breakfast for her visiting family, Emily smiled at the sound of children's laughter, mixing with the gentle barking of dogs who had never known fear or uncertainty, who lived in a world made safer by the courage of previous generations who had chosen to speak truth to power regardless of the personal cost. The little girl who had wrapped Max in her winter coat and carried him to safety had grown into a woman who understood that love is most powerful when it includes the courage to face whatever threatens the people we care about most. Some truths are indeed too difficult for children to bear alone, but there is wisdom in recognizing when those children have grown strong enough to help carry the burden of doing what is right. Emily's story, Max's story, Uncle Robert's story had become part of the foundation upon which new generations built their understanding of family, courage, and the complex ways that protecting the people we love sometimes requires risking everything we have to lose. In the end, the greatest protection parents can offer their children is not the illusion of a world without danger, but the knowledge that they will never face that danger alone. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the garden where another generation of children played safely, their security purchased by the courage of those who had chosen truth over comfort, justice over safety, and love over fear. And in that warm kitchen filled with the sounds of family, Emily Chen understood that the frightened 8-year-old who had found her dog shivering on a cold porch had indeed been right about the most important thing of all families. Stick together when things get hard, and love finds a way to make everything work out, even when the path forward seems impossible to see.